We're definitely going to get to the sci-fi pistol in a bit, but first we're going to look at a halfway realistic example. This is a pretty simple scene, but it definitely includes the important concepts. Let's say my goal is to do a textural overlay like this one. So what we're looking at here is first just a basic black and white image, but through the way that it is masked, you can see it's not uniformly applied. If we hide the mask for a second, we can see this is what it would look like if it were just uniformly overlaid. You can see it just as prominently over the yellow, over the gray, and over the moss. What I've actually done is made the mask in such a way as to make it more prominent over the gray, less prominent over the yellow, and not at all visible over the moss. To do that, we have to understand the ways that we can manipulate selections. And to get started with that, I'm actually going to go here to this very basic document, but stick with me, this is important stuff. So what we are doing is we are adding, subtracting, and looking for intersections. So with these three shapes here, I've made them each on their own layer. So if I want to, I can kind of control click and pull up a selection of the entire circle, the entire triangle, etc. Well, if I wanted to have a selection that included, we'll say, the triangle and the square, what I need to do is add to the selection. So I can start by holding control and clicking on the triangle, and then I need to add the square. So the way I do that is not just control clicking, because that would just switch the one that's selected. I add in shift. So control click for the first one, shift control click for the second one, and now I have an added selection. The next thing to know is how to do a subtraction. Let's say I only want the circle, but I don't want where it overlaps with the other two shapes. So I'd start with the circle, and then I would control alt to subtract. That's command option on a Mac, I'm pretty sure. And then control alt for the square. And there we've subtracted both. Well, sometimes what you're going to actually want is the intersection of two shapes. So I don't want just the circle or just the triangle. I only want kind of like the Venn diagram where the two meet. Well, to do that, I'll start with either one. So I'll start with control click to get my triangle, and then I will control alt shift click on the circle. And what that gives me is just this shape where the two are overlapping. Now, it should be said that this is not only something for existing selection layers. We'll say I want to draw a shape here, and I just drew that with the lasso, any kind of manual shape you want, but I only want where this overlaps with the circle. Well, here's where I can mix and match. So I've drawn manually part of the selection, then I control alt shift on the circle layer, and I get that overlap. So that right there was a selection that might have been hard to make through any other method. If you wanted to try and carefully trace right along there, even with a Cintiq, that's really hard to do. So a lot of times if I want one shape, I'll work on the internal edges and then go way over the external edges, knowing that I can do some keyboard shortcut combo to trim my selection based on other selections I've already made. So you have make a selection, add to the selection with control shift, subtract from the selection with control alt, and intersect with control alt shift. These will become second nature, but it's something important to practice. Armed with that knowledge, we are going to make an overlay just like the one I've shown here. So we're just going to start with a totally opaque layer. And I know that I'm going to set it to the multiply blending mode, so we'll do that first. Now I need to build a selection that's going to hide it the way I want to. So remember, I wanted it to be most visible over gray. We'll call that 100%. We'll say 50% visible over yellow, maybe less. Let's say only 30% visible over yellow and not at all visible over moss. Well, let's see what this document has in the way of selection layers. So I've made these ahead of time, and this is what I encourage you to do when you kind of locked in part of your illustration. And even though these layers overlap each other, each one has its own transparency. So if I want to have just the 0,3, I can control click on that. Same goes for the bottom stripe. And then the moss is probably the most complicated of them. It's a little more photographic. Okay, so I've got these options. I'll usually keep them hidden, and I'm going to use that as a base. So first off, let's say I know I only want it within the box. I don't want it going over the background. So I'm going to click my box or my silhouette selection, and I'm going to apply that as a mask. So now what we have is the most basic of masks. It just keeps everything inside the lines. On the little layer thumbnail, you can see here, there's a white box and a black outside. If you want to see it a little bit bigger, you can actually hold down Alt and click on that. And this here is looking at all of the mask pixels. White is visible, black is hidden. What I want to do next is to lower the visibility of the yellow paint here down to about 30%. So how do you think I'd do that? Well, that's right. I'm going to need to add to the selection. So first I'll select the bottom stripe and then add to that the 03. So here I have all the yellow paint selected. And now I'm going to go back into that mask here. I've just held down Alt and I've clicked on the mask thumbnail. What I need to do is have these not be white pixels anymore, and they need to be dark gray. Well, you can do filters and whatever kind of commands you want here as long as they work on black and white pixels. So I'll do the levels command, and I'm just going to darken this down. And you could do any command that would darken the pixels. I'm going to, here's 50%. I want to go even a little darker. Okay. So I've just modified the black and white pixels inside the mask here. And when I Alt click on it, we can see the end result. All right, now we're getting somewhere. So here I'll hide it, and you can see that's what it looks like without any sort of masking. And here we're starting to get the mask we're looking for. It's more prominent over gray and less prominent over yellow. We still have the moss problem though. So now I'm going to go back to my selection layers and see what I have to work with. Well, I have one for moss, so I can hide that. I don't need to actually see it. I just need to control click on the moss selection layer, which gives me that moss selection. Go back into the mask thumbnail. And as you might guess, what I want is black pixels because I want it to be not at all visible wherever there's moss. So I'll go back into levels, drop it down until it's pure black, deselect. So before I show the results, what do we expect to see here? We expect to see the overlay most visible where there's white. That would be 100% visible. Significantly less visible where there's dark gray. And then not at all visible where there's black. And that's exactly what we see. So these little panel segments between the bricks are not at all visible wherever there's moss, slightly visible wherever there's yellow, but very visible wherever there's gray. Again, I'll hide the progress we made, and you can see it's just totally slapped on top, and it doesn't really match the image. But then adding a nice mask like that makes it integrate so much better.